Okay, I guess we can get started. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces here. I am İpek Yosmoğlu. I'm the director of the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies here at the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern, and I also teach history at the history department. And today it is my pleasure and great honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Nilay Özok-Gündoğan. Nilay is an associate professor of Ottoman and Middle East history at Florida State University. By the way, all of you should be following what is happening in Florida to universities. Just a side note here. Nilay received her PhD from Binghamton University in 2011. Her research centers on modern state-making, elite formation, property regimes, and intercommunal conflict and coexistence in the Ottoman Empire. Her work stands at the junction of interconnected Ottoman, Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish histories. She also writes about the questions of methodology in Kurdish studies, and she has a host of articles, publications. They have appeared in journals such as Journal of Social History, International Journal of Middle East Studies, and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In addition to all of this, Nilay also is a regular contributor to Jadaliya, and she writes op-eds about the broader Middle East and Kurdish politics and history. Today, she will be talking to us. She'll be presenting a section from her book, her recent book published by Edinburgh Press in 2022, titled Kurdish Nobility in the Ottoman Empire, Loyalty, Autonomy, and Privilege. Here it is. Go and buy it. And so I will first, before I leave the floor to her, I should also introduce our commentator and moderator today, Anoush Tamar Suni. I think many of you are already familiar with Anoush if you have been following our programming for the last 2 years. She's one of our 2 postdoctoral fellows, and she is a social anthropologist. She earned her PhD from UCLA in 2019, and she's now working on a book project during her residency here at the Buffett Institute. So without further ado, I'll just leave the microphone, Zoom, camera, whatever it is, to our speaker and our commentator.
İpek, thank you so much for this generous introduction, and thank you also for putting this together. I am really honored to be here. And thank you, Anoush, for agreeing to serve as the discussant. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on my book. And Alison, thank you so much for taking care of all the practicalities. And it is like we did this before, but it is my first Zoom talk after the pandemic frenzy was over. So it kind of feels interesting. But I would like to share my screen if possible. Should I be the host for that or co-host?
You should be able to.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to say a few words about the cover image here. It was made for this book by the Kurdish artist Nurettin Arkan. And the process of like him making this was also very exciting for me because we, of course, looked at the current images of Palu, where my research is based on. But I also told him about how I imagined this place in the 1840s, 1850s, what it looked like possibly, and the things that I felt like was important in terms of all these agricultural land, the bare mountains and all of that. And then the end result is really prettier than my imagination. So I would like to really thank him for that. In the last days of August 1848, the inhabitants of Weshen, a village nestled in a secluded valley on the banks of the eastern Euphrates, woke early. The men met at the village mosque to perform the pre-sunrise prayer, marking the beginning of a 3-day Muslim holiday celebrating the end of Ramadan. Just before the prayer began, they heard the sound of distant gunfire. As the noise approached, the prayer goers saw that it was being made by Abdullah Beg, the Hakim, or the ruler of the Palu Emirate, and at least 600 armed men. They were coming to collect 1.5 tons of clarified butter from the villagers in payment for 4 years of back taxes owed to Abdullah Beg. The villagers responded by opening fire. It turned bloody, with 3 villagers dead and 4 wounded. The despairing villagers then fled to the surrounding hills. The next day, Abdullah Beg came back with his men and set the village on fire, burning 65 houses and buildings to the ground, along with stored grain, animals and their fodder, poplar trees, and vineyards. On the surface, this event seems like just one among many conflicts about agrarian surplus extraction the world over. What neither Abdullah Beg nor the villagers knew was that the incident would trigger a series of events that would break up the Kurdish Beg's hereditary rule in the Ottoman Empire. Abdullah Beg was a descendant of the Palu Umera, plural of emir, or alternatively mir, or beg, that had ruled the emirate for more than 3 centuries. Successive Ottoman sultans recognized the Palu Beg's hereditary rulership over the emirate from the 1550s, the time when it came under Ottoman suzerainty onward. Within a year, this violent encounter would cost Abdullah Beg his position as Hakim, his land holdings, and when the Ottoman state exiled him to Tekfurdağı in Rumelia, 900 miles away from the lands that his ancestors had ruled for centuries, his bond with his homeland. And with the end of Abdullah Beg's career came the end of the Beg's hereditary rule in Palu. You see here, Palu is in the Kurdish Armenian populated eastern frontier of the empire, highlighted with yellow here. Kurdish emirates and the elite families have been the cornerstones of both popular and academic historical renditions of Kurds and Kurdistan. From the late medieval era through the modern age, the rise and fall of the Kurdish emirates has constituted a key aspect of Kurdish history. But although the emirates feature in popular notions of Kurdish history, they are barely addressed in actual historical research. The scant existing scholarship has focused on the most powerful Kurdish ruling houses, namely the Baban based in Süleymaniye, Botan based in Cizre, and Soran based in Rwandos on the border with Iran. You see those emirates on the map here. All 3 disappeared from the political arena in the second half of the 19th century as a result of Ottoman military campaigns. Abdullah Beg, who destroyed Weshen village on that hot August day, was also a member of an elite Kurdish family, the leaders of the Palu Emirate. This emirate was geographically smaller and politically less significant in the 19th century than the previously mentioned emirates. The Palu Begs did not respond to the Ottoman state's mid-19th century centralization politics with large-scale uprising. It is true that Abdullah Beg, like the rulers of the 3 emirates that I mentioned, was exiled by the Ottoman imperial state around the same time period. The rest of the family, however, stayed in their historic homeland and continued to claim rulership of the emirate for several decades after Abdullah Beg's exile. So the Palu Beg's modern history does not fit with the nationalist interpretations of the Kurdish past, in which the Kurdish ruling families represent heroic resistance to the Ottoman state's military and political encroachments during the long 19th century. Additionally, unlike Bedirhan Beg's sons and the Babans, who became the flag bearers of Kurdish national identity, the majority of the Palu Beg's descendants were integrated into the mainstream Muslim Turkish identity. In the 19th century, the family's relationship with the Kurdish identity was debatable. In their dealings with the Ottoman state, the Begs hardly ever mentioned being Kurdish, and when they talked about tribes or other groups they perceived as recalcitrant or unlawful, the Begs referred to them as Ekrad and Ashair, Kurds and tribes. This derogatory tone echoed the Ottoman state's dominant usage towards these groups. While distinguishing themselves from Kurdishness as such, the Polubegs embraced and emphasized the claim that they were a family of begs descended from Cemşit Beg, who was granted this position by Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent. So this is a contemporary view of Polu from Weshen. On a hot summer day in 2013, I visited Polu in search of descendants of the Polubegs. My initial inquiry led me to a young man. Dressed in a suit, he pointed out the window and said that he owned the quarry by the hill. His voice could not hide his pride. This was one of several references to his wealth. He was proud of his connection to the Begs, but they were totally fabricated. The actual descendant of the Begs, a retired teacher in his mid-50s, came to meet with me in a decrepit Renault 12, probably from the early 1990s. He seemed happy to have the attention of an historian interested in his ancestors and mentioned that the quarry owner was a Nuwarish whose desire for a noble past had led him to the Polubegs. In Polu, a small district that is now an impoverished backwater, the title of Beg had survived into the 21st century. The Beg's wealth, however, had not. I found it puzzling that the title persisted when its bearers had long since fallen from grace, that it was potent enough that a well-to-do person would claim it. The Beg's real descendants could prove their noble identity via a temlikname, a title deed from the Ottoman sultans that recognized their hereditary rulership over the Polu Emirate that they kept in a chest in their attic. And this is a piece of the temlikname granted to the Polubegs in the 16th century. This is only one piece of it. Those who know Ottoman documents know that it's indeed much longer than what you see on the screen. The absence of hereditary nobility in the Ottoman Empire is a foundational assumption in Ottoman historical writing. Generations of Ottoman historians have based their theories, conceptualizations, and narratives of Ottoman administrative system on the idea that hereditary nobility had no legal place in Ottoman political administrative system. According to this widely accepted view, the Ottoman state diverged from its European counterparts in terms of its persistent opposition to hereditary rights and privileges. This theory is based on references to three institutions seen as the building blocks of the classical Ottoman regime, namely gradual Ottomanization of ruling aristocracies in the newly conquered areas, the devşirme or child levy system, and müsaadere. Let us look at these one by one, beginning with the idea that the early Ottoman methods of conquest worked by gradually incorporating local aristocracies. According to this claim, the Ottoman state followed the two-stage policy towards incorporating the newly conquered territories. So what I will talk about next few minutes is basically like the foundational arguments that we teach in our classes about Ottoman political and administrative system. So first, when the Ottoman state conquered a new territory, it established a form of suzerainty, and then it tried to eliminate the local dynasties by establishing direct control through instituting the main fiscal and military institutions of the Ottoman administrative system. One important way the Ottoman state approached the question of the indigenous noble families was to appoint them to important positions within the administrative machinery. With Mehmed II's reign from around 1451 until 81, the doors of the highest offices in the central administration, including the Grand Vizierate, were open to Balkan aristocracies, Greek, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Albanian elites. Even the fallen Byzantine ruling dynasty was subsumed into the Ottoman ruling elite. The logic for incorporating the former Balkan and Byzantine aristocracies in the Ottoman administration was that it prevented them from becoming rival nodes of power. The second pillar that supports the claim of the lack of a hereditary nobility in the Ottoman Empire is the system of meritocracy that served as a primary instrument of elite formation in Ottoman statecraft through the devşirme or child levy system. The system, which forcibly recruited young Christian boys from across the Ottoman territories and created a slave or kul army and court bureaucracy of Ottoman civilian and military officials whose sole loyalty lay with the Sultan. The purpose of this system was to counteract the emergence of hereditary nobility by creating a select group of military and civilian officials loyal to the Sultan. And third, Ottoman historians deem müsaadere, or the state's confiscation of the wealth and property of deposed elites, as another indication of the empire's intolerance towards elite groups accumulating inheritable wealth and power. Again, from the rule of Mehmed II, Ottoman sultans institutionalized müsaadere to prevent the formation of hereditary nobility. So, in a nutshell, our understanding of the lack of nobility in the Ottoman Empire is mostly based on these the interpretations of these systems. So, the belief that the Ottoman state was different from its European counterparts in terms of being fundamentally inimical to hereditary offices and privileges also found an echo in the writings of the European political philosophers. The Renaissance political theorist Machiavelli described the Ottoman state as ruled by, quote, a prince with a body of servants, different from the French state, which was ruled by a prince and barons, who hold that dignity by antiquity of blood and not by the grace of the prince, unquote. Ottoman observers of the later centuries also emphasized what they considered the unique method of elite formation by the Ottoman state. For instance, in his political treatise, 17th century Ottoman diplomat Ibrahim Müteferrika stated that the Ottoman state was not comparable to other states because in the latter, I'm quoting, posts belong to the nobility and are hereditary, while the Sultan grants offices to whoever is worthy, unquote. So, originating from the writings of the Ottoman and European observers alike, the idea that the de jure hereditary nobility was non-existent in Ottoman political administrative system trickled into Ottoman historical writings as one of the most widely accepted and rarely questioned doctrines of the field. But in the book and in this talk today, I would like to highlight some of the problems with this framework, with this established notion, because this thesis is based on the persistence of the assumption that the state meant the central administration at the capital, and that it successfully abolished any rival dynastic claims with the policies mentioned above, and that it had absolute control over other elite groups at the center and in the provinces. But the field's foundational works about the nature of the early Ottoman state and its approach to hereditary nobility were based mostly on the early Ottoman conquests, mostly in the Balkans and in Anatolia. As such, in Ottoman historiography, when we talk about the pre-Ottoman nobility in the newly conquered territories, we are primarily referring to the Byzantine, Balkan, and Turkoman aristocracies. These regions' experience of Ottoman conquest did not necessarily reflect the experiences of other areas that came under the Ottoman rule much later. That is, the empire expanded with more conquests. The reality of elite formation became much more complex and much more diverse, but the meta-narrative of the lack of hereditary nobilities based on these early centuries' experiences remained intact. But where does this idea come from, apart from this, methodological focus on the early centuries? It also comes from a certain belief that there was one type of nobility in Europe, which was uniform across time and space with no historical variations. So for Ottoman historians, the French nobility is usually the prototype of European nobility. And this is not just the case for the Ottoman scholarship. European historiography at large based their agenda on the nobility, mostly on the French case. Based on an entrenched estate system constituting a corporate body with hereditary rights that the monarch could not seize, the French model was considered the ideal and thus the basis for comparisons and conclusions about the Ottoman case. But I ask, what if the mirror image of Ottoman nobility discussions, that is the European nobility, was instead a kaleidoscopic reality, much more complex than our ideal type of French nobility? Revisionist approaches within various strands of European historiography have presented a more nuanced and historicized portrait instead of the long prevalent ideal type definition of nobility. The single term nobility, one scholar states, should comprehend a spectrum of people which stretched from the leaders of small communities of several hundred people through to an elite group of families which dominated a single county, to a supra-regional elite. And also, unlike the French model, not all noble groups were legally defined as an estate by the monarch. In fact, that is the exception rather than the rule. Nobility not only had regional variations, but also urban-rural divisions, power and wealth differentials, variations in manners and etiquette. And all of these make it really impossible to discuss nobility as a uniform category. And the nobility's political power significantly varied across place and time. Not all nobles in or out of Europe were represented in a representative body. That is also mostly the exception, not the rule. So, but then you might be asking, but what if nobility is an elite, which is open, imperfectly defined, as one scholar says, and subject to regional variation? You may ask what nobility actually entails. What are some of the things that we need to be looking at in order to describe an elite group as a part of a nobility? Despite variations, there are patterns that allow us to deploy the concept to understand certain elite groups. So originating in a pre-capitalist socioeconomic environment, nobility at its most basic entails entitlement or preemptive claims on resources by virtue of one's own distinguished position, one scholar says. So there are two concepts that are really important to understand nobilities. One is service, and the other one is privilege. So as far as service is concerned, we are talking mostly about military service at the beginnings of the formation of a noble group. Military roles and responsibilities were critical in the initial formation of the Kurdish nobility as a privileged group as well. The making of the nobility also involves a process of ideological construction that allowed them to justify their status and wealth by virtue of a descent from noble ancestors. So there's an ideological and a cultural process at play. As for noble privilege, so if the first one is service, the other one is privilege, privilege refers to rights granted to a specific group based on hereditary descent from a venerable ancestor. Privilege, one historian states, is European nobility's only indispensable characteristics, unquote. Though their wealth, political power, degree of authority, and their mere size varied according to region and context, there is no such thing as nobles without privilege. Noble privileges included rights in political, juridical, fiscal, and social realms. These rights could be positive or in the forms of exemption, negative. Rights let nobles do things others could not. Exemptions freed them from obligations others had to perform. So in the book, this is the larger conceptual framework that I think is relevant to understand Kurdish nobility. We can use the conceptualization of hereditary nobility to talk about these like big ruling houses of Kurdistan. And we need to be referring to the service and privilege as two important elements of the formation of nobility in the Kurdish case. So then the question is, what did noble privilege entail in the case of Kurdish begs, and more specifically, the begs of Palu, which is at the center of my book and my research? How were their rights and exceptions and prerogatives defined? The answers to these questions will help us conceptualize noble privilege in the Ottoman context better. So, in order to understand this, we need to go back to the first encounter between the Ottoman Empire and the Kurdish ruling houses back in the 16th century, within the context of the Ottoman-Safavid imperial rivalry. And, you know, Kurdistan is literally the borderline or the frontier area between these two imperial entities. And the Safavids were the ruling dynasty in Iran in the early 16th century. And Kurdistan became the major battle zone between these two formidable empires in the 16th century. And the first encounter that shaped the Kurdish begs' military, fiscal, and administrative prerogatives happened within this context. So in the book, I describe this context as a formative moment of the formation of the Kurdish nobility, because during this Eastern campaign, Sultan Selim sent Idris Bitlisi, the Ottoman envoy, to talk to Kurdish elites. So when the Idris Bitlisi had this diplomatic, communication with the Kurdish elites, he operated on the basis of one understanding that these Kurdish elites, ruling houses, had hereditary rule over these lands for a while. And since when they had these negotiations with the Kurdish elites, they kept this in mind, that these guys had a hereditary rule over these lands for at least 2 centuries. So his ambassadorial skills was really critical in this regard. Not only was he familiar with the region, but he also understood the sociopolitical organization of a Kurdish leadership and the way their noble lineage allowed them to claim the right to rule over these territories. Idris Bitlisi himself was also Kurdish, but we know ethnicity, ethnic identity, and belonging, these are also historical concepts. So we can't, automatically translate it into an ethnic bonding or belonging as we think in the 21st century. But within this context, we see that Kurdistan came under the Ottoman rule in a particular way. And the particular sociopolitical organization that defined the Kurdish Beg's privileges came under the banner of the Hükümet, which literally means government. What separated Hükümet as an administrative organization from usual or ordinary Ottoman sanjaks was that Hükümets were designed as Mefruzul Kalem and Maktuul Kadem in the administrative system. These 2 terms refer to the formulation of a certain degree of in a particular type of autonomy for the Kurdish emirates. So Mefruzul Kalem referred to the Hükümet's immunity from having Tamars. So this is the building block of Ottoman military and administrative system. Whereas Maktuul Kadem referred to the idea that Ottoman administrators cannot be sent to the areas ruled by the Kurdish nobility. And so these 2 concepts, Mefruzul Kalem and Maktuul Kadem, define the position of the Kurdish emirates within the Ottoman administrative system and gave them a certain degree of autonomy by recognizing the hereditary rule of these elite families and assign them particular privileges in this way. So going back to this Temessükname or Temlikname or Mülkname, this is the document that established the Palubegs as a privileged nobility in the Ottoman realm around 1535. So the privileges decreed by the Sultan reflected the imperial state's recognition of the Beg's existing authority over these territories. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but the point that I would like to emphasize here is that the wording of this Temlikname is not arbitrary. So I want to give you a few examples to show that the recognition of autonomy of the Kurdish ruling houses and the definition of the privileges was a conscious policy from the Ottoman administrators in this context. So the document is quite explicit. It says the aforementioned Begs of Kurdistan had held and possessed these territories and castles from the time immemorial, which had been their yurts and ocaks. The Temlikname also stated that Kurdistan Begs aforementioned castles and territories that they inherited from their ancestors would stay in their control. So I can elaborate on this in the QA section more, but this Temlikname did a few things, but in this context, two important things. One, I see that this recognizes the hereditary rule of this ruling household. And secondly, the references to the Kurdistan Begs. When the Ottoman Sultan talks about the Kurdistan Begs, it is referring to them as a collective or a corporate body, and they have a say in the selection process of their leadership. So these two aspects are really key in understanding the formation of the Kurdish nobility within the Ottoman realm. So this is a pedigree or a genealogy. The descendants of the Palubegs kindly shared this with me. As you see, this is just one piece of it. And this is another example of a genealogy. So genealogies are really significant for understanding the nobility. To speak of nobility, Mark Bloch wrote, is to speak of pedigrees. And because the way to justify hereditary rights over landed wealth in times of economic distress, or to protect pre-existing fiscal or political privileges vis-a-vis a potentially hostile monarch was often through genealogy. And the Palubegs had a consciousness of their noble identity and had a conspicuous interest in their pedigrees. One example that I detail in the book is that in 1682, the ruling Hakim of Palu at the time, Yansur Beg, asked his scribe Shem'i to translate Şerefname into Ottoman from Persian. So Şerefname was a history of the Kurdish dynasties and ruling houses completed in 1597. Şeref Khan himself was also a Kurdish noble and one of the begs of the Bitlis Emirate. And the way Shem'i talks about the background to this translation is really illuminating. He says the idea of translating this work into Ottoman came when guests of Yansur Beg, many of whom were also Kurdish begs, began discussing their ancestors and their role. As they shared what they know about their noble past, they consulted Şerefname and realized that it was filled with information. Yansur Beg then commissioned Shem'i to translate it. Yansur Beg's patronage of the translation of Şerefname is an example of the Kurdish begs' interest in documenting the history of their noble ancestors. One interesting detail here is that Shem'i not only translated the text, but also added an appendix to Şerefname and the translation, which talks about the history of the Palu begs, specifically the family who commissioned the translation of Şerefname. So, from the 16th until the 18th century, the Kurdish nobility was tied to the Ottoman imperial realm mainly through military service. After Cemşit Beg died, the begs were frequently summoned to Ottoman campaigns in Iran and elsewhere, and as far away as Algeria. Remember how I mentioned that service is important for the definition of the nobility. During the 18th century, the Palu begs were summoned to serve in several military campaigns against Iran, Hungary, Habsburg, and Russia, but compliance became even rarer than in the first century of the Ottoman, of the Kurdish begs. So now in the book, yes, I define this group as a noble group, but I also talk about service and privilege as historical concepts. Historical in the sense that the definition of these terms defined the degree of autonomy that the Kurdish elites had or maintained with respect to the Ottoman imperial center. So initially, from around the 16th century until the 18th century, it was mostly the military service. But we will see that around the 18th century, the participation of the Palu begs in the military campaigns diminished dramatically. And from a conventional account, one could describe this as resistance, okay, or an antagonistic relationship that they don't want to participate in the Ottoman military campaigns. But the reality is different. The Palu begs started to participate in the military campaigns less because of a new responsibility or a new type of service that they had to provide in the 18th century, which is the mines, related to mines. So the Keban mines was close to Palu and a lot of other Kurdish noble households. And the areas close to these mines became responsible for providing charcoal to these two most important mining area in the Ottoman realm. And as they became more and more, responsible for providing for the mines, that became also put on paper. We see, for instance, that the latest revision of the original Temlikname, which happened in 1841, mine work is defined as one of the conditions to renew the privileges that was defined back in the 16th century. So in the book, I make this larger point that we cannot just talk about Kurdish history only by looking at the 16th and 19th century or the beginning and the end of what we describe as autonomy. But if we use these two concepts like privilege and service, what we see is like a very dynamic relationship between the Kurdish ruling houses and the Ottoman imperial center. So this is a larger argument that I make across like 4 chapters to understand how the centuries between these two ends witnessed during these centuries, Kurds witnessed the transformation of their attachment to the Ottoman imperial center. So I want to say a few more things about how things change after the 19th century. I'm sure some of these points I will have an opportunity to elaborate more in the QA section. But remember how I talked about how I opened with this vignette about Abdullah Beg, one of the descendants of Cemşit Beg in the 19th century. He is destroying one of the villages of Palu. It happens to be one of the Kurdish villages, by the way. But he died childless. Okay. So before the period after his death, let me say a few words about what this incident represents in the larger history of the Kurdish nobility. When invasion happened, I read these documents and I was literally puzzled by the drastic consequences of this seemingly ordinary happening. It is like rural conflicts in the imperial context. It is really ordinary. But since the event resulted in the death of villagers and the destruction of the village, the villagers' insistence appeals eventually brought about a criminal case. And that also resulted in the exile of Abdullah Beg and his death in a year. But after his death, the Ottoman state put into effect a grand scheme of abolishing or confiscating the lands of the Polo nobility and distributing it, opening it up for sale of the Polo population. So this is a formative moment. And I ask this question in the book. Imagine right around the same time, in 1846-47, the Ottoman state is organizing massive military campaigns against the Kurdish nobles of the different parts of Kurdistan. So why are they so hesitant? Why do they wait until his exile and his eventual death to put into effect this grand scheme of land confiscation and land sale? And I make this point that there is something about legitimacy. The Ottoman imperial state, they don't want to annul the privileges granted to this family back in the 16th century automatically, because from around the 16th century until the 19th century, whenever the Ottoman state attempted to abolish these privileges, the begs, they literally brought the Temlikname that I showed you and made a claim about the sultans and how in the wording of the Temlikname, it says it is actually binding. It has to be respected by the future sultans and it shouldn't be changed. So what is at stake here is a question of legitimacy. Legitimacy in the sense that the Ottoman administrators within the centralization context of the 19th century, they don't want to really target the imperial heritage, which goes back to the 16th century Ottoman sultans. And they take this moment as a, convenient moment to initiate a change, referring to practicalities. And the justification that they use to abolish noble privilege is based on the realities as they describe it. One justification comes from the fact that we gave these privileges to Kurdish nobility because we needed their military service. They use this terminology. But now we have a regular army and we don't need to recognize these privileges anymore. And the second thing is about the political economy of the land ownership in Kurdistan. So they refer to the fact that the Kurdish nobles, because of the privileges given to them back in the 16th century, they don't pay any taxes. So the surplus extraction is exclusively in the hands of the Kurdish nobility. So using a political economy justification, they argue that we have to abolish the privileges of the Kurdish nobles altogether in order to increase the revenues coming from this region. And the book is not just about the nobility. So the nobility just gives me an opportunity to talk about the changes that happened in this part of the empire from the 16th century all the way until the mid-19th century, when the region becomes the scene for ethno-religious violence and the massacres, especially in 1895, of the Armenian population. So I argue that this moment of land confiscation and the changes that it creates in the local power dynamics and land ownership constitutes the background for confessional or ethno-religious violence in the region. And the 1895 massacres in fact, reverses some of the changes that happened in land ownership in a way that what we define now as Armenian dispossession is actually dispossession of the Armenian population after they acquired some land from the land confiscation scheme of the Ottoman state in the 1840s. So by talking about ethnic violence within this particular context of land ownership, I kind of want to think about the significance of privilege and the significance of noble entitlement to land and its surplus as one of the driving forces for violence between the local communities in the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Özok-Gündoğan, for sharing your work with us today. And thank you, Professor Yosmaoğlu, for the introduction and also for the invitation to engage with this wonderful book. It was really an absolute pleasure to read this path-breaking book, The Kurdish Nobility in the Ottoman Empire, which beyond being a scholarly masterpiece that deconstructs and reconstructs conventional ways of viewing Kurdish and Ottoman history from a variety of angles, is also a really beautifully written book. The book opens with a gripping anecdote of the burning of the village of Weshin in 1848 by Abdullah Beg, the Emir of Palu, which we heard a little bit about. And this anecdote is written in such evocative prose that from the beginning of the book, the reader is drawn into that time and space, and it feels as if you're watching an immersive documentary. Throughout the book, the author introduces each chapter with an equally vivid anecdote, which she then elaborates on and analyzes with a wealth of archival material. That the result is a manuscript that is not only empirically rich and powerful in its arguments, but is also gripping and often very surprising in the historical stories that it tells. When I picked up this book to read it, I couldn't put it down until I came to the end, and then I was left wanting more. And so I hope the author will consider a sequel that will pick up where this story left off. Before I move on to my reflections on the book and some initial questions, I would like to share a little bit about my connection with Palu. So I'm an Armenian-American social anthropologist who's conducted fieldwork for over a decade in the Kurdish regions of contemporary southeastern Turkey. And though my main research focuses on the region of Van, to the east of the area addressed in this book, my first fieldwork experience in Turkey's Kurdistan took place coincidentally within the geography encompassed by this book. When I was a master's student at Sabancı University in 2011, I spent about a month in the village of Havav, where I participated in a project organized by the Hrant Dink Foundation in Istanbul, which brought together Armenian, Turkish, Kurdish, and international youth to the village to join in the restoration of 2 medieval Armenian fountains there. I participated in that restoration project, and as part of my master's research, I interviewed the villagers, who are now Sunni Muslim, Kurmanji, and Zazaki-speaking Kurds, about their memories of the former Armenian inhabitants of the area. Towards the end of my stay in Havav, I decided to visit the nearby ruins of the city of Palu, along with 2 other American volunteers. So we took a taxi. We told the driver we wanted to go to the old city of Palu, and he drove us to this hillside and told us that's as far as he could take us, and left us there and said if we wanted to see the old city, we had to hike over the hill. And we didn't know where we were going, so we climbed up the hill, which I learned from the book was the site of the Urartian castle, which the author describes. And when we came to the top, we could see the panoramic view of the ruins of the old city of Palu, with the Murat River flowing around the city. Most of the area at that time was empty of buildings, yet covered with really vibrant emerald green grass. And sprouting up among the grass were the monumental ruins of the old city, including a hammam, a church, and other half-destroyed stone buildings. There were no people anywhere in sight, though we could see further down the river a cluster of buildings that make up the new city of Palu. And though at the time I did not know the details of the history of Palu, the ruined old city was haunting, and its empty buildings and its silent spaces were witness to historical violence and tragedy. So after a decade of remembering that haunting scene of old Palu, Dr. Özok-Gündoğan's book finally filled in that mysterious history that I had been wondering about for these many years. And this book does not only fill a gap for me, but indeed it makes many important interventions in the fields of Ottoman, Kurdish, Armenian, and Middle East history in addition to studies of local nobility as intermediaries between central governments and local actors in the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. First, this book fills a gap in the literature on Kurdish emirates by widening the scholarly lens beyond those that are commonly referred to, such as the Bohtan Emirate in Cizre, as the author focuses on the lesser-known Kurdish emirate of Palu. And through this example, the book tells three interconnected stories. First, it details the transformation of the relationship between the Ottoman center and the Palu nobility from the time that they were incorporated into the Ottoman realm in the 16th century through the 19th century. Second, it considers the primary role of land possession in the formation of the Palu hereditary nobility and their subsequent conflicts with the Ottoman state. And finally, it examines the relationships between the Palu nobility and local populations, including Kurdish tribes, Ottoman officials, and Armenians of various positions, including wealthy Armenian sarrafs or moneylenders in Istanbul, as well as local farmers. The book highlights the changing role of the Palu hereditary nobility over time and outlines their shifting relationships with various actors, local and beyond. The author emphasizes how local actors, including villagers, were not silent bystanders, but instead played an active role in challenging the power and prestige of the nobility as they attempted to mobilize the reforms of the Tanzimat to their advantage through writing petitions and opening court cases. Finally, the book demonstrates how the upending of a previous balance between the begs, state officials, and local Armenians and Muslims eventually created the climate of violence in which the massacres and widespread destruction of the 1890s took place. This book provides a refreshing critique of many of the standard narratives about Ottoman and Kurdish history and offers convincing alternatives through the rich archival evidence. For instance, in the discussion of the autonomy of the Kurdish emirates, the book critiques the anachronistic presentist nation-state fallacy that portrays relations between the Ottoman state and the Kurdish elites as a zero-sum game, a struggle between autonomy or control. And instead, the author offers a nuanced study of the varied and surprising ways in which the Kurdish nobility negotiated their position as local power brokers to their advantage. The book carefully avoids ethno-national and teleological narratives of Kurdish history, and instead focuses on the historical imperial context. Rather than thinking of two sides of a competition in which Kurdish elite and the Ottoman court are antagonistic towards one another, the author positions the nobility as an intermediary between the government and the commoners. The book highlights many histories and communities that have been marginalized, if not silenced or altogether written out of Ottoman and Kurdish history. The author takes the Palu Begs as the case study, a local group of nobility that is marginal even in the history of the Kurdish emirates and within the narrative of the contemporary Kurdish movement regarding historical Kurdish autonomy. The author writes, and I quote, "The history of the Palu Begs is not one of historic resistance, of heroic resistance, but one of a noble family who justified their fiscal, military, and administrative privileges by referring to the imperial state's recognition." Finally, and this is one of the many points in which our work intersects, the author excavates the interconnected histories of Kurds and Armenians in the space of Palu, which she points out is of great import in both Armenian and Kurdish collective memory. For Armenians, it is the birthplace of Mesrop Mashtots, who created the Armenian alphabet in the 6th century. And for Kurds, it is the birthplace of Sheikh Said, who led a rebellion against the nascent Turkish Republic in 1925. The author carefully deconstructs the common trope of Kurds and Armenians as living separate from one another and interacting only in exceptional spaces of violence and genocide. Rather, the author provides us the details of the everyday interactions of Kurds and Armenians, characterized by both competition and cooperation. The book outlines, for instance, how in some cases, Armenians supported the Kurdish Begs in their conflicts with the Ottoman state, how Armenian sarrafs lent money to Kurdish Begs, in support of their economic projects, and how later wealthy Armenians tried to buy the lands of the begs that had been confiscated by the state. The author's careful reconstruction of these intertwined histories contradicts common narratives that read ethnocentric divides back anachronistically into the past. So next, I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask to the author, and I'd like to encourage the audience now, if you have questions, to type them in the chat. And after I ask one or two questions myself, I will draw questions from the chat and pose them to our guest. So first, yes, my first question is, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in learning about the positionality of the researcher in relation to the project. So I'd like to ask, what led you to this project and to write this book? How did your positionality and your background as a researcher shape your relationship with your material? And not only the archival material, but also with the people in Palu and with the living descendants of the Palu begs whom you met and you read about in the book. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Nilay, and then I'll come back for another question.
Anoush, thank you so much for the wonderful description of the book and in its contributions. I'm really in awe of your articulation of the material that I wrote. I was thinking, oh, did I write this? So it was like a great description. Thank you so much for that. And another interesting fun fact here, you said that your journey started with Palu, and I'm from Van. Interesting. And it actually is a nice segue with your question, I guess, because my mom often asks me, why are you so interested in Palu? Why are you not writing on Van? Because both of my parents are from Van, even though I did not grow up in Van. We would go in the summer. So my attachment and my connection is beyond, like above and beyond the actual time that I spent in Van. So she asks this very same question, not from an anthropologist's point of view, but out of just sheer curiosity. What brought me to Palu was not Palu itself. I started this to talk about or think about the history of Kurdistan within the Ottoman context with a few general and genuine questions, historiographical questions, because as I started to read more and more in Ottoman history, I realized that like there is this expanding critical scholarship about the Ottoman provinces, and I'm talking about the 2000s now, maybe 2006 and 2007. I was just like a fresh graduate of political science, and I was trying to see what is happening in the historical discipline, because the political science that I learned did not really answer my questions about life or history. So, and then I just started to read this all exciting literature about Ottoman provincial historiography. And that was literally like something clicked in my mind. Why don't I know anything about Ottoman Kurdistan? Or what I think I know is not really answering my questions about the past of my people, basically. Why don't I know anything about this? Then as I kept reading about Ottoman historiography, I wanted to contribute to the scholarship by writing a critical history of Kurdistan within the Ottoman context. But that wasn't like an easy choice, because now we have a better, like a more developed scholarship on this part of the empire. But at the time, we only had a few works, and Janet Klein's work was the major inspiration for me to see how we can think of the history of Kurdistan within this particular imperial context. But then as I started to conduct my archival research, I maintained my interest really broad. I was literally like an anthropologist in the field. I was at the archives trying to get to know my people, my subjects, and the dynamics. And I just sifted through the catalogs. Back in time, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman archives was not digitized as we have right now. So we literally sifted through the catalogs and reading the summaries. Ipek, maybe you would remember this. But then I did not look for something. It is because I was operating in an historiography where our knowledge of the region coming from like an Ottoman historical perspective was quite limited. So as I sifted through the documents, I just literally was trying to get a sense of what are some of the important turning points in history of Kurdistan in the 19th century or long 19th century. And then from that first archival visit, I came back with a lot of questions, but not a research topic. Because when I started my PhD, this was my only research agenda. I want to write the history of Kurdistan from an imperial point of view, nothing more specific than that. But then as I read the documents, as I got to know my, archival sources better, Western case just kept getting catching my eye. This one village, and I couldn't even for a while understand which village they were talking about, because they translated in the Ottoman archives, they transliterated that initially as Vishin. And then I read the documents. You can read it in so many different ways. Vishin, Veshin, Weshin, Wushin. So because you basically transliterate it. But then I figured that in the grand scheme of things, this is not an important place. Why is this case such an ordinary happening from a peripheral region, from a village which I don't even know about? Why does it become such a big deal? What is happening here? So I searched back and forth to see what is happening before the incident and after the incident. And then I realized that, well, this is like a micro incident. Something happened, but then it changed something about the larger socioeconomic structures and hierarchies and power configurations in this region. So partly it is coincidental that I pursued what happened in Weshin, just like how I designed my talk and how I designed the book itself, and I have crafted the narrative. I pursued back and forth to understand why it was so important for the Ottoman elites, for Kurds, and for Armenians in the 1840s. But then that brought me to this larger issue or larger historiographical questions that I was pursuing, such as why do we always talk about Kurdish elites and the Ottoman state in an antagonistic way? If all the Kurdish elites if they all pursued heroic resistance to the state surrounding them, the end result does not really show that heroic resistance altogether. So there must be instances in which people made different choices. But then that also supports another historiographical agenda that I had, which is incorporating Kurds into historical narratives as complex agents or as complex actors, not just heroes, not just as elites, not just as those who complied or those caved in, but just like any other ethnic or religious group, Kurds made different choices. They were complex and they had hierarchies within the community. So all of these brought me to the case of Palu, because this really gave me an opportunity to debunk some of the conventional narratives of Kurdish history or the history of Kurdistan within the Ottoman Empire.
Amazing. That was such an exciting answer. I feel like you took us all on your intellectual journey into the archive, and you crafted your talk, and I must say you crafted the book also taking us on that journey, because you start with the Weshin incident, you set it up as a puzzle. We're all wondering what's happening, and you bring us through the whole book in that way. And I think you do such a wonderful job of debunking all of these so many kind of received narratives about Ottoman history, Kurdish history. It's wonderful. So for my second question, I'll ask another question. Meanwhile, I encourage the audience to write your questions in the chat, because we'll come back to you after this. So for my second question, I want to start with the last line of the introduction of the book, where you're writing about the current situation of the descendants of the Palu Begs. And you write, and I quote, "What remained of a glorious past was a tarnished prestige because of their ill-reputed acts during the Armenian massacres and faded imperial decrees, which they still kept as the only proof of a noble pedigree," end quote. So my question here is, how are the massacres and the pedigree read now? In this area, we have Kurmanji and Zazaki speaking Kurdish communities and Turkish communities, as well as both Alevi and Sunni communities, some conservative, some more left-leaning. So how do these various communities see the Begs and talk about that past? And also, how do the descendants of the Begs themselves remember and talk about that past?
So yes, thank you, Anoush. I now realize that I actually skipped the second part of your answer about the positionality of myself as a researcher here, and it connects me back to that question as well. So it is interesting. When I went to Palu in 2013 summer, I did not even know if I could find any descendants. We just went there. My husband, he's also a sociologist, so we went together, and then we started asking people that we knew from Dersim area, because that greater Dersim and greater Palu areas have been historically connected. But then I just started with a general inquiry if there are any descendants. And as I mentioned in my talk, I was fooled, you know, somebody just pretended that they were descendants of the Begs. So I'm saying this because Begs as a concept, like as an honorific title, people know about Begs in Palu right now. And then they in fact talk about them, oh, I think they're from the Begs descendant. And there are certain last names that are associated with the family, like the descendants of Cemşit Beg. But from the time period that I am looking at, if I compare with the contemporary context and where the Beg title stands and what people know about that, what type of conflicts, what type of tensions it involves, there is a huge gap. And that gap is not just because of time, it is because the Sheikh Said rebellion of 1925 is a significant turning point in terms of the changing leadership in the region. Changing leadership in the sense that Sheikh Said and then the religious authority, religious elites really become the notable leaders in the community after that point. And I will be anecdotal here, but I think it will help me explain what I mean by this, like Begs versus Sheikh Said's tradition as a conflict. The descendant of the Beg, who was really nice, who helped me a lot, and it is the first time, by the way, that they shared their documents with a researcher. He picked us up, and he was driving us in his car. But then there was like another car driving, a nicer car, a newer car, possibly more expensive. And the driver was like what he described as a mullah. Mullah in the sense that like a religious figure, a religious authority, possibly supporter of the Sheikh Said tradition. That's what he said. And they almost had a road rage. And that was like such an emblematic moment for me, because the Sheikh Said tradition after 1925, or the religious authority, if we want to describe it in a more like in more broader terms, and the Beg's tradition, as one fades, the other one becomes the community leader in the long 19th century, but especially in the early 20th century. So that was an interesting observation. But during my conversation with them, with the Begs, of course, the question of Armenian lands and then the Armenian population would come up, but in ways that was coded, not talked about openly, and not mentioned in an explicit way. In just one instance, they mentioned that there are some rumors about their ancestors in terms of what happened to the Armenian population, but they said they don't think that it happened. But the conversation back and forth always came to two things. One is their noble identity, not with the exact same terminology, but proving that they had it with the documents or talking about it as they heard it from their ancestors. And the second thing is land. Land as in like an item that is out there with no economic value anymore. But it's fertile, it is important, but it doesn't bring any economic value anymore because of the transformations and then because of the conflicts that Kurdistan witnessed in the second half of the 20th century, especially with the war. So the Armenian aspects, what happened to the Armenian population, just like what is the case in the Turkish mainstream public, is only through euphemisms, only through implications, not talked about in an open way. So this is like my experience with the descendants, but I don't know how what kind of answers I would receive from the larger Palu population if I spoke to them, which I did not, because all I wanted to do was the descendants themselves. But one interesting thing that I noticed was that they have like different turning points in their historical memory in terms of what happened to their family. And that goes back to, for instance, they talk about the early Republican period as an instance of land confiscation, which is really not true. Land confiscation happened much earlier, and I don't know of any instance of like land confiscation that happened to this particular elite. And so the prestige tarnish, the economic structures change, and we are not talking about a wealthy family anymore, but the historical memory pertaining to the Armenians is mostly spoken through, coded language, euphemisms, and a defensive position, which I think is like being defensive also says a lot. It is very different from what I would see in the larger mainstream conversation in ways that I really need to emphasize here. Even when they are not talking about the Armenians, they still talk about a context in which people lived in relatively peaceful ways. And that reconstruction of that memory gave me the idea that there is some sort of tension here. There is some sort of tension in terms of coming to terms with the past, which I will talk about in the book, a few years from that first encounter.
Wonderful. Such an interesting description. And I'm very excited to hear that your family is from Van, because I think in my travels and studies, the ruined city of Palu and the ruined city of Van share a lot of sort of similarities. Mm-hmm. So I guess as a sequel to this book, maybe you could consider a book about Van, since you have all of that. It is
so interesting. Maybe as an anthropologist, you will help me wrap my head around this thing. I somehow avoid from Van as a scholarly case of inquiry, and somehow I end up around the larger, greater Palu area. No wonder my second book will be about the Keyman Ergani mines and
okay, well,
issues related to.
Yeah, oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I see it.
All right. Well, yes, that sounds like a very good third and fourth book topic. So I have some more questions, but first I'll go to the chat. So first we have from Ronald Suni. The comment is, wonderful lecture. There are parallels between your analysis. Oh, let's see. He's raising his hand. Oh, maybe I'll let him say his question. Would you like to speak your question?
Yes, I'll speak it. So that was a wonderful lecture, really. It sounds like a great book. I'm a Russian historian, so you'll forgive me for intruding on Ottoman history. But there's a real parallel here between how the Russian nobility, roughly 15th, 16th century, was formed, and your story. And it's so interesting to me. So the Tsar created out of whoever he could find service nobles who had horses or whatever and could serve the Tsar and protect the realm. And they were given land in exchange for that service. But over time, that land became hereditary. So it went from what's called in Russian pomestье to votchina. And I was wondering, this seems like almost a natural process in Russia. It's not, it's historical, but they hardly ever took land away. Once pomestье became votchina and became hereditary, the Tsars basically, right through till 1917, recognized this as hereditary land and didn't confiscate it. How would you, is there a way of saying how the sultans could possibly do that and create what I understand to be the chaos in Eastern Anatolia after the destruction of the Badr Khan, Beatli-centered and so forth emirates?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is interesting because like when I was reading about the nobilities, I also read about the Russian examples, Russian aristocracies and noble groups, not extensively, but the discussions that I found about modernization of the nobility, how they are seen mostly, especially in Russian historiography, as they belong to a time that is now past, and they represent underdevelopment, backwardness. Those discussions I found interesting. And you're right. I mean, all these cases that I looked at from different parts of the world, like from China to Eastern Europe to even Mexico, there is this association with like land being recognized as hereditary and defining an elite group in particular ways that is similar across the board in different regions. In the Ottoman context, you're right. I also find that quite interesting. From what you're saying here, I see that it was not hereditary at the beginning, but it became hereditary down the road. For the Kurdish case, I think that is the difference. It was hereditary before the Ottoman entry into the region. It was recognized as such when the Kurdish elites came under Ottoman rule, and it continued to be hereditary up until the 19th century. And that is a question that I find quite curious, especially when I think of this in relation to the larger questions of Ottoman historiography. How can we really think that hereditary nobility was non-existent in the Ottoman context, given that there are all these elite groups? I'm specifically referring to the Kurdish elites. Not only they had the land as in a hereditary form, but they also never lost it for almost 4 centuries, and the Sultan never confiscated the land. So it could have, but they didn't. Ottoman Imperial Center never attempted to abolish these hereditary privileges before the 19th century. So that is a curious question for me. And then in the book, I try to understand it by looking at the changing regional and imperial dynamics and how the definition of the hereditary privileges go hand in hand with the definition of service, and how the Ottoman state defines what they need from the elite groups. And there I make this interesting observation on my part. When I read the documents, most of the time we talk about the Ottoman state power when it comes to the Kurdish hereditary nobles in this particular way. If the Ottoman state threatens to abolish the hereditary privileges, then it must indicate a powerful point or like an increase of power of the imperial state, which is really not true. Whenever the Ottoman state was in a more vulnerable position in terms of its need for military service or material needs, it sounded more aggressive. It sounded more threatening. And that's when it threatened to abolish the hereditary privileges. So most of the time when we talk about this relationship, scholars take the Ottoman imperial state's wording and administrative discourse for granted, and they interpret it as a decreasing level of autonomy of the Kurdish elites, increasing power of the Ottoman imperial state. But when I look at my case, it's totally the inverse relationship. Whenever the Ottoman state feels more vulnerable, they start to have a problem with the privileges that these elite groups have. So I don't know if I answered your question, but these are some of the thoughts that I have when you ask that question.
Wonderful. So I will read a question from my colleague here, Ekin Kurtiç, and then there is a question from Ulaş. So first, Ekin writes, "Thank you for this wonderful talk and book. I'm curious to hear more about the coal mine workers and their relationship to the Beys and their privileged position. In a way, they are the laborers making possible the material conditions out of which Beys privilege is produced and reproduced. Were you able to find in the archives any accounts of the mine workers? Who were they? What kinds of roles did they play in reproducing or challenging the power position of the elites?"
Ekin, thank you very much for this wonderful question. I was just curious to know when the coal mines, are you referring to a specific mining area or the Keban-Ergani mines that I mentioned? Yes. Okay, they have, this is, okay, I always say this to people when they ask me questions about mines, give me 2 hours because that's my hobby to talk about mines in the Ottoman Empire. So in the book, I have this one chapter on the 18th century. And in that book, I talk about how mine work, how the existence, like the presence of the mines changed the relationship between the elite groups, Ottoman elites and the Ottoman state. And there I also give some indication as to how mine work and labor in relation to that were significant dynamics changing the local power configurations in the 18th century. So the Keban-Ergani mines, let me just give a little bit of background about why the Keban-Ergani mines are important, because this is the single most important mining area. Perhaps we can think of it in relation to the Gümüşhane mines, because like copper, gold, and silver extracted from these 2 mining areas, they are the major raw materials for the Ottoman military industry and for the Ottoman mints, okay? So like these mines are very crucial. And then I talk about the establishment of the specific mine administration. I'm now entering my second book area. I'm giving you hints on that as well. But the mine work that I talk about within this specific book is a particular type of mine work, which is dependent on the provisioning of charcoal, which is the main fuel for the mines. So the charcoal is used to smelt mines, right? But charcoal is not a natural item. It is not out there in nature. It is produced through conscious human action. So what connected the area into the mines was mostly the provisioning of charcoal. But the provisioning of charcoal takes place in a complex regional economy and local ecology, if you will, because in order to get the charcoal, laborers, loggers need to go to the mountains. They have to cut the trees and they have to send it through the Euphrates River to the mine area on keleks, which is made out of animal skins. And then the rafts or the keleks would be disassembled and the animal skins will be recirculated back into the market. Okay, so there's like a complex regional economy of the provisioning of charcoal here, which is something that I'm looking at in some detail in this second chapter. But as far as the mine workers are concerned, so I think what you have in mind is the people who actually work in the mines, right? Okay, miners, because in this pre-capitalist context, mining labor is a very complex division of labor in the sense that we have loggers, we have others who actually burn the charcoal, and we have those who transport it. And Maybags, Kurdish nobility, are responsible for basically gathering all the labor and establish the relationship between the laborers and the mine organization. But the actual people who worked in the mines, that is an interesting topic because the majority of them come from Gümüşhane. The majority of them come from Gümüşhane, and then their travel is also an interesting narrative. I'm hoping to explain in more detail because as they walk, they sometimes destroy the areas in their journey from Gümüşhane to the mining area. So there's a lot going on here. So the question is also methodological if there is information. Yes, for the second book, I finished its research and now I'm working on the documents. There is actually a lot of information about the miners or the different components of the mine work, both within the mines and outside of the mines. But I haven't finished yet. So that is something that I'm still working on. But in this current book, I talked about mine work, mostly in relation to the labor that is taking place outside of the mines. But there is one interesting fact about the miners who are within the mines under the soil, if you will. There are Greeks, for instance, Greek laborers working in the mines. But then Armenians, they are also miners, but they are also the creditors who give loans within the larger mining industry. So it is like a very complex division of labor that is taking place within an integrated, intricate regional economy context. I know I did not respond to your question fully, but I can give some insights in this way.
Fascinating. I am looking forward to the next book. So next, I'll let Ulash ask his question. He's a PhD student here at Northwestern.
Hi, Hocam. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. This will be somewhat of a selfish question about my own research. So I'm a second-year political science student here, and I'm working on civil wars, insurgencies, how they affect state building, how they affect elites, whether there are like differences between elite-led civil wars and non-elite-led civil wars. And my idea was to basically, and I'm trying to think through my dissertation, whether it's possible to, work on the topics that I'm interested in. And what I am right now thinking is basically trying to compare earlier Kurdish rebellions with the PKK insurgency and whether there are some differences. And I'm mostly interested in comparative historical work. So if I work on these issues, I definitely need to, learn more about the Kurdish elites during the Ottoman Empire. And you kind of mentioned that like the current state of field is really undeveloped. And I'm not a professional historian, and mostly political scientists rely on really good historical work when they do this type of stuff. So I was wondering your thoughts about whether it would be possible as a political science student to do that kind of research, especially given that I'm not trained in historiography, that I wouldn't really be able to go to archives and study this as truly as you do. So I was just wondering your thoughts about whether it would be possible to study 19th century and 20th century Kurdish rebellions from let's say mostly using secondary sources. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ulash, for this question. I was thinking with you as you mentioned your research, and whether it is possible to do this using only secondary sources given the state of the historiography. And I find this question really interesting and important because I also write and think about the current state of Kurdish studies at large, beyond the beyond the disciplinary boundaries. And within the Kurdish studies scholarship, history is definitely the minority. It is limited across the board for all time periods, I would say. But it is evolving. It's definitely, there's a lot of really important, significant and beautiful work that is being done by scholars on different time periods, especially late 19th, early 20th century in terms of the Kurdish elite groups, in terms of different moments of mobilization, uprising, and revolt. There's some work in Turkish, there's some work in Kurdish, and I believe you want to focus on the Ottoman imperial time period when you say you want to compare Kurdish revolts. Because the Republican period is a different story. There are similar problems when it comes to the scarcity of historical scholarship, but there is some work being done. But what I observe as someone who works on the Ottoman Empire, when I look at the general patterns in this evolving scholarship, well, there's exciting work. There is environmental history being done. There is more interest in complicating the dichotomous relationship between the elites and the states. But there is still a lot of emphasis on these moments of what I describe as moments of explosion in Kurdish historiography, meaning moments of uprisings or revolts or persecution or massacres. And maybe Anoush would agree with me on that, populations historically persecuted, especially in their recent history, this is generally the pattern in their historical scholarship, something that I want to address in my scholarship rather than emphasizing how they are destroyed or how they operated in unusual circumstances. I want to incorporate these groups as parts of ordinary flow of life in different ways and in different capacities. But the short answer to your question is that might be a little bit challenging to make a comparative work comparing the earlier historic Kurdish revolts with the most recent movement, because we don't have that much work done. And the available work mostly focuses on the political aspects of these revolts, which I think is not really sufficient to understand them in their larger historical context. Yeah, I think I didn't give you a satisfactory answer, but bits and pieces of what I think about it.
Wonderful. So we have a question. We have 5 minutes left. So we have a question from another PhD student here at Northwestern, from Hazal Özdemir. And she writes, "Thank you for this amazing talk. This might be outside of the period you covered in the book, but Palu was, oh, there it is. Palu was an important center of Armenian transatlantic migration in the 1890s and early 1900s. Did you come across the effects of this outbound migration in your archival work? Was it a dynamic which shifted the relations between Kurds and Armenians and local relationships in addition to the Armenian massacres?"
So thank you, Hazal, for this question. Well, I bring like the analysis that's in my book until 1896. And it's just like a sudden, abrupt end because, well, a lot, of course, practicalities, because the book was 8 chapters and I couldn't afford to make it much longer than that. But there is also an analytical reason here, because that moment of destruction changed a lot of dynamics within the locality. And if I had to take it all the way until the early 20th century, I don't think I could have stopped before I covered the genocidal context. So there is like a justification for my understanding of why I define the chronology as such. But referring to your specific question about migration, David Gottman's book, he focused on Harput, and it's like we see this, he does a wonderful job of showing how migration and transatlantic migration of the Armenian population is a key dynamic that changed lives. And when I look at the time period, within the time period that I'm focusing on, that's really not the case. I mean, in the 1890s, I don't see that being a significant factor changing the Armenian population's life in around Palu. And I find that interesting, but my answer to this is there is a lot of imperial mobility when it comes to the Palu Armenians. And compared to Harput, I'm not saying this from an authoritative point of view, because I did not work on mobility specifically, but from what I understand, looking at different years, different phenomena, migration was not a really important parameter for Palu Armenians before the late 1900s. I mean, before the late 1800s. Definitely after 1895, more so, I would say 1900s, early 20th century. But mobility at the imperial level is really important for the experiences of the Armenians. And I talk about that, how that factors into local politics as well. But maybe like people like you who work on transatlantic migration can make that comparison. Why Harput was such an important epicenter of migration, whereas Palu really was not around the same time period. That's also a question that I point out in the book as well.
Thank you for the answer. I think Palu is interesting because in the Ottoman State archives, I didn't really come across documents about imperial mobility, Armenian mobility, but there are a lot of sources about migrants from Palu in American archives.
Mm-hmm.
So
like,
I think like
which time period?
Roughly like early 1900s. Like,
yes.
And after the 1908 revolution. But
That's
I didn't.
sorry.
No, I'm sorry, but I didn't come across Armenians who were denaturalized, who Tarkitabiet from Palu.
I see. That is interesting, and that's very much in line with what I think happened in terms of the timing of migration from Palu into Americas, which I think was not before the 1890s, late 1890s, more so 1900s, I would say, early 1900s.
And the majority migrated to Providence. There's a graveyard.
Interesting.
Armenians, yeah. Interesting. Thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
Wonderful. There is another question in the chat, but we are right at 2 o'clock. So we'll have to save that. I encourage you all to get this book and email your questions to Professor Özok-Gündoğan. And I would like to thank you Professor Özok-Gündoğan, for your amazing presentation, for sharing your work with us. And on behalf of the Keyman program, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and thank you for putting this together. And Rojda, I saw your question and I will answer it in the email and I have a response for this. There is a shift and I think that's an important question. And thank you so much for these wonderful questions and thank you for putting this together.